us. As you may have heard, recording is in progress. So just to remind people that we will be recording this session and putting it up on the YouTube channel for the seminar series. But before we kind of start, welcome everyone to, I think, what is our penultimate paper of the digital history seminar for the IHR. At the end, I'll tell you a little bit about the next paper that will be coming up. But we are really delighted today to welcome Matti La Mela to the seminar series, who will be giving a paper, and I'll introduce Matti in a second. A couple of quick housekeeping points, as I'm sure everyone is very well aware, but Matti's going to speak and give a paper for about half an hour or so, loosely, based on kind of the inspiration that comes obviously in the moment, after which we open the floor to questions. So please, if you have burning questions, you can already start kind of putting them to us. If not, wait until the end and we can communicate them to Matti. So without further ado, let's introduce our speaker. So Matti La Mela is an associate senior lecturer in digital humanities at Uppsala University in the Department of ALM. And his background is in social science history, and he has experience in multidisciplinary digital humanities research. His recent work has focused on digital history methods, the history of property rights, and research infrastructure, so things like parliamentary data and historical patent data. And the paper that he's giving today, which I'm fascinated to hear more about, is called Accessing Nature Before Allemansrätten. I think I've said that in a very Germanic way, which is probably incorrect. But it's then kind of prefaced by saying, using computational text analysis to study a tradition before it was named. So if all is okay with you, Matti, I shall pass over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and so nice to see you all here, and it's great, really nice that to talk about my work and present a bit this paper, or let's say part of a bigger project that I'm currently working on. I'll just first share my screen. Okay, and let me see.
Looks perfect.
It's good. Everything, I'll just close the Zoom. Windows a bit tidier. Okay. So thank you, and my name is Matti La Mela, like I said, at the Department of ALM at Uppsala University, and this is a project that I'm currently working on here in Uppsala. Something that I've started a bit earlier, and now trying and also implementing more, let's say, computational text analysis methods to study right of public access to nature, something called Allemansrätten. More about that in the following slides. So the broader idea of this project and this paper that I'm talking about today, it's part of a project where I'm, let's say, revising this tradition of access rights to nature in Sweden and Finland, and more broadly in Scandinavia. Norway has also a similar tradition today. The broader question is about public access rights in general. So I've been interested in property rights on nature, especially these kind of more invisible resources. So some smaller, let's say, not only timber and wood that are quite common topics, but something that still are very important in many contexts today. Free natural resources, depending on the context. If we think about other national contexts internationally today, globally, lots of foraging, picking different kind of natural resources, selling them, trading them, and using in consumption, especially for poorer population. I mean, this is something that is highly important today. So my question is about this critical revision of this tradition, Allemansrätten, and then at the same time also theorizing, let's say, discussions about commons and also how these kind of public property rights emerge. Just very briefly about Allemansrätten today, if you travel to Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, also Norway, it's possible for everybody to access a natural environment, to even roam freely on public and private land. So it doesn't matter if it's publicly or privately owned. You can go to wild nature. You can go there for recreational purposes, pick wild berries, stay overnight, and so forth, based on this tradition or customary right called Allemansrätten. Allemansrätten is employed very much in tourism also. You can see that in country branding today. So sometimes advertised pictures where people are camping somewhere in the forest, and Allemansrätten is used there. Allemansrätten also allows commercial use of these non-timber resources, so berries and mushrooms, and often when one talks about Allemansrätten, when we read about it in literature, it is portrayed as a kind of tradition or Nordic cultural heritage. And what causes conflicts today is that this tradition or customary right is not defined explicitly in law. So you don't find legislation which clearly says that, for example, you can pick this and this much berries, or you can camp for one day and then you have to change the location or something like that. So it's a kind of collection of different restrictions and limitations that you find in different pieces of legislation. And between the countries, there are small differences. In Sweden, you have Allemansrätten has a constitutional role, and for example, this constitutional law states that everyone shall have access to the natural environment in accordance with the right of public access, Allemansrätten, notwithstanding the above provisions, which is about protection of property and so forth. So it's a kind of well, not gray area, but kind of constitutional anchoring. That's what the legal scholars are using. So something that must be allowed and given to everybody universally. So it's not something that's related to being a Swedish citizen, for example, but more like a universal principle. And of course, because of this kind of narrative of Allemansrätten being a tradition, and the commercial use is something that causes conflicts. And the berry companies and mushrooms companies today, just to give you an example, they invite berry pickers from, let's say, destinations like East Asian countries. Thailand, for example, there have been berry pickers coming to Sweden, Finland also during the summer, invited by the berry companies, but they pick the wild berries with this right of public access and then sell the berries to the berry companies. So this is a kind of tricky situations because you don't have to have any work contracts, or previously. Now there's more regulation coming in because of this tricky situation. So people were using Allemansrätten to actually organize, let's say, commercially oriented, industrial oriented berry picking, and that has caused previously conflicts still today. So this is one of the hot topics every summer, appearing and much discussed in the media. And here's an example just from research that when the right of public access is introduced in official descriptions, it is described as cultural heritage and a national symbol, both for the Nordic region at large, for the individual Nordic countries. But then what the interesting thing and what is the kind of starting point for the broader project perhaps, but for this paper is that we know that the modern Allemansrätten actually appeared as a term only in the 1930s. So it's a term that becomes commonly used only, let's say, starting from the 1950s, but especially then 60s, 70s, and so forth, both in Sweden and Finland. For example, in Finland, we find the term appearing as a kind of permission to fish during the war times, because the war evacuees from the eastern regions in Finland settled in around the country, and this kind of everyman's right to fish was established, so that everybody could fish and could get a livelihood, because there were not so much, let's say, food and other livelihood for these people. So fishing was one possibility that was allowed and called everyman's right to fish. If we just do a kind of digital text search exercise very briefly, we look at parliamentary debates, we look at newspapers, we see the same pattern, that this term itself doesn't really appear. The first peak in the parliamentary debate is about this everyman's right to fish, but the latter peaks, 1970s, 80s, it's about this right to actually right to roam. Same in Swedish newspapers, we clearly see that's 1950s. It's a bit of kind of testing the term. There are a bit of debate that does this legal concept exist or not, and then slowly it becomes appropriated and kind of much more used in the public debate. So of course the question then arises that was there a concept before the term, and there has been a bit of discussion in the research literature. Some scholars claiming that actually this is kind of invented thing, that you cannot find something like this actually before, and this was a way to open up the nature for the public, that by saying that there's a phenomenon called Allemansrätten, then actually everybody could spend their holidays and vacations in the nature. So it's much related to urbanization and actually creation of legislation about vacation for workers, working people, and so forth. So this kind of development clearly is visible with Allemansrätten. But of course, then the question is: there a longer Nordic tradition behind here? Can we find some practices that we could call Allemansrätten even before the term was labeled as such? And today, and the paper is about this first part, so I'm looking also about let's say transnational relations between the Nordic countries. So when the concept was articulated, how did it move between the Nordic countries? How was it challenged? How was it used in branding for the Nordic countries, and so forth? But this first part is really about studying, so the kind of question: how can we study something, a tradition that is not named yet? And here is a cartoon from early 1940s about this everyman's right to fish. So this landowner is coming and asking that. So because there were different regulations, what was the extent of this everyman's right to fish? So the person is asking that, are you from here? Because today it's only those who actually live here are allowed to fish. So here we see that something that would be completely allowed today, this kind of fishing with a rod, it's now part of Allemansrätten in Finland. But already here we see that the situation is not so clear that perhaps expected. Bit about theory, we can go much more into these, but just some kind of building blocks and kind of methodological tradition where I'm coming from. So we can think about the broader literature about property rights in historical contexts. First of all, kind of how do property rights emerge? This is very strong in economic history. Lots of discussion in institutional economics. Douglas North, for example, has written a lot about this. Just the kind of basic principle of something gaining value, which means that there are expectations for the future use of this resource, or and then there are more and more claims about actually how can we enforce the property rights to something with value. And Elinor Ostrom's work about commons also related that communities themselves, they can actually manage these resources. And it's something that's, of course, the question here, that are we talking about a kind of common resource, or is it actually really, because it's a universal right? So this is really open access to, for example, wild berries and mushrooms. So the community cannot really, even local communities, they cannot really manage the use of these resources. So we are really going beyond commons here. But something very important, especially when we think about the historical context. So how is the management of these resources talked about? Then a tradition about property rights embedded in social structures. So the kind of discussion of who are proper owners in a nation state. Can we see that certain groups are not perhaps better owners, but it would be perhaps good to see that smaller communities control their own resources, or are there some resources that everybody, let's say in the broader national community, can access and use. So different kind of layers, for example, of ownership. Congos, Tieleman, Santos are talking about this. So often these are situations of mix of different kind of property rights, private, common, combined in different ways. Then there's a clearly development of commodification taking place, something where I want to tie this work to history of capitalism much clearer. So of course we can see this development as well, the resources, the forests are getting more and more valuable. So we can also talk about the kind of commodity frontier here. So in the next slide, I will show a bit about exports of wild berries from Sweden and Finland. So we see that there is a growing demand for these resources. That means that these commodities are not used locally, but they are also traded. So there's a kind of broader international chain of using and appropriating these resources in some kind of industrial production. So how do Finland and Sweden tie to this is of course a very relevant question when we are talking about these resources. And then the kind of my tradition of digital history. This is a digital history seminar, so we can talk much more about this. I'm combining computational and manual work in my research. So that means that kind of way that Joe Goldie has been talking about digital history, that we are quite iterative in our work. So depending on what kind of data, what kind of possibilities do we have with the tools we are using, perhaps ready-made interfaces even, we take use of those. We first test the limits, try them, and at the same time critically evaluate how much we are able to actually do with the data and tools we are using, kind of iteratively going back and forth and testing our research questions and so forth. And at the same time, I have been mainly working with in broader and bigger research groups. So having had the possibility to work with research engineers, computer scientists, so forth, who have quite advanced technical skills. But this is of course something that we as historians should be able to do that. We do not always need a broader team behind us. So that's why I think it's also important to consider always if we have what is enough for us. Coming back to our research questions, are the ready-made tools, is the research interface enough for us? So, and perhaps step by step, trying to include more elements of more advanced analysis in our work. This is something I've written. Unfortunately, the text is in Finnish, but this is a university textbook where we wrote a chapter about digital history with a dear colleague, Mila Oiva, cultural historian. So that's something how I see how we as digital historians should work. So now I move a bit towards the kind of more empirical case. Yeah, I just wanted to show you a bit, just these kind of starting points I think are very important when we are framing our research case. Here I'm using some export statistics that I've collected from previous work. So with the orange color, we have exports of wild berries, in this case, lingo berries, from Finland, and then the dark gray or dark blue color is berry exports from Sweden. And then the light blue is just newspaper searches about lingonberry and both in Swedish and Finnish. And this has been to try to contextualize a bit more the phenomenon we are talking about. And clearly, first of all, we see that there's actually quite a lot of there's much more and more news about these berries themselves, and something that slightly take place or happen, say, while actually the real phenomenon takes place. So we can see that there's first perhaps discussion taking place about the berries, and then slowly also exports taking off a bit. So first of all, we see that the Swedish exports boom somewhere in 1880s, 1890s, and then the Finnish exports follow. And what happens when we look at the Swedish and Finnish newspapers is that actually Finland follows quite a lot what is happening in Sweden. It's really interesting because in the 19th century, the countries share the same language, so they could just copy the same newspaper articles and publish them again in the Finnish newspapers. So this is a kind of one kind of contextual framing, looking at what's happening in the media, is that this phenomenon, kind of expectations about use of these resources is taking place. We don't know what happened so much in the berry woods, who were picking and so forth, but we just see that there is clearly interest about these resources, and then we already see that in the export statistics, actually exports take place. And if we look at the newspapers, just kind of very quick starting points, I think it's good to look at these two. So what the contemporaries of that time thought about wild berries is clearly that they had big plans, kind of visions about how these resources could be used. So for example, here in one newspaper article, they compare lingonberry exports to or let's say industrial production, including exports of lingonberries to Finland's forestry. So they say that they write that Finland's forestry gives us currently 70 million marks, and lingonberries would result into something like 12 million marks. So of course, this is just speculation, just thinking about it. There's not so much reality, and this didn't ever happen so much. Of course, there were attempts to do it, but this is very important, thinking that, okay, we could do this and so forth. For the purposes of ownership, going back to access rights, all the time when looking at these materials, I tried to look at, okay, what do they say about the property rights? Did they think that everybody could pick these berries and so forth? And when we read these materials, who could pick the berries? Here we, for example, find in this article that they write that the lingonberry industry does not require more than some work by women and children during 3-4 weeks every autumn. So the idea is that we should allow berry picking for these groups. Often you see also idle people mentioned, old people, elderly people, people who are not landowners and so forth. So at the same time, they are creating kind of a group of people that would be in need of getting a bit of work to actually sustain themselves. So of course, we can go to discussions about poor relief and so forth. So these groups could get money from the woods and could actually sustain themselves by picking berries. So these kind of searches and kind of contextualizations help us to understand a bit the phenomena that is taking place. So what I intended to do, so these are kind of excerpts from here and there, and what I intend to do more systematically is now to trace Allemansrätten from two perspectives. So we don't have the term, and we need to look at something else that is happening in the woods at that time. The first step is to study practices of accessing nature. So this means that with different sources, we would look at actual practice of going to the woods, and of course, we don't find camping or recreational activities so much. Some of that was taking place, of course, already in the 19th century, but not so much yet, kind of recreation or tourism and so forth. Of course, urbanization was already taking place a bit, but not to such a large extent that in other places. So the idea is to look at how were these berries used, who picked them, and so forth. And I'm doing a kind of geographic text analysis there, following work like Patterson and Gregory. Excuse me, just to close that. They have Ian Gregory has lots of work about this kind of geographic analysis, and I'm trying to look at both location information in these articles, but especially kind of analysis of the content about why, how were these berries understood? So was it just a small local kind of thing that children could do, or can we find something more serious? Can we find something about the property rights and so forth when we look at the content of these articles? And then something that is more like work in progress currently, just give a few insights to that we can talk more later. I refer to some previous work I've done since the 1940s by using parliamentary debates. So let's say that tradition before tradition kind of idea, we need to look at kind of semantics of this concept. So my solution is currently that I look at other terms that I know that appear and that were discussed in these historical contexts. For example, the names of these resources, lingonberry, mushrooms, and so forth. And again, try to locate and find discourse, legal discourse in this case, about the access rights. The parliamentary datasets are available for both countries, and that's what I'm currently processing. Okay, I'll go through this example, and then I'll give you say a few words briefly about the parliamentary data case, and then conclude the presentation. So the first approach is to look at geography of news, and like said, I hope to find kind of economic industrial kind of the discourse that I showed a few examples about berry picking. And how does the process go? I have currently a corpus of newspaper articles from the newspapers. I have conducted named entity recognition using Stanford NER. This was a couple of years ago, so we could do that with the large language models today, but we got the quite good quality there. So I've used this labeling currently. So this is about finding the locations that are discussed together with berry picking. So the kind of rationale is that if it's about local places, small places, in contrast to, for example, Germany or port cities, it gives a completely different horizon on how these berries were understood. And then I've added some classification to these journal articles, and with Ekta Watt's colleague, computer scientist, we used bird language model to classify automatically these articles into kind of industrial economic and, let's say, descriptive articles, which includes everything else. Currently, I will give some examples about how to visualize this stuff. Bit of the training data. So these kind of examples you find in the newspaper articles. So these descriptive narrative articles are more like snake with the child who was picking berries, or the autumn is arriving and the berries are ripe. So this is just newspaper articles where berry picking appears just as a kind of background information. It's not really about berry picking, but the person was, for example, picking berries in some context. And then more like really articles with an economic rationale. Berries are exported from Sweden to Germany and so forth. And what we find here is a growth in these economic industrial articles, but more importantly was kind of group of articles that the algorithm had difficulties in classifying, or when verifying this, seeing that this was the kind of border cases or gray areas which wasn't so clear to put into either economic, industrial, or descriptive narrative. And as a result, this actually helped to find a third category to be included into classification. So this I wanted to just give us an example of the iterative process. That while working with these methods, we have to get back all the time, change the kind of starting premises, and here in this case, how many classes to use. I mean, this kind of binary is very simple classification task, and of course we could continue with fourth and fifth and sixth class, but here quite naturally it became clear that there's something happening here, and it was exactly this kind of conflict or articles that interdict access to private land. So clearly there was something taking place. There were more and more small announcements in the newspapers where they actually wrote that berry picking, hunting, and other stuff is not allowed on my land, which was a rather interesting finding. There's a reference just to red-based work, and I think this is something that we all should read a bit, this kind of idea of algorithmic failure. So something that I think is very useful when working with these methods, and when the method is failing, it's not a failure per se, but actually helps us to focus our attention on something that is actually interesting and relevant for us. Okay, I'm a bit over time already, but just wanted to show a bit about the findings, how this kind of geography text analysis looks like. So here is, for example, articles from 1860, 1885, the earlier period, and we see on the left-hand side all the descriptive articles and the places found in those, and on the right-hand side all the economic industrial articles and all the locations there. And clearly already we see that the descriptive articles are more scattered. That means that berry picking is not in a central role, but it's these kind of articles where children were picking berries in some small place and they got lost in the woods. And that means that whole Finland is covered and it's a bit scattered here and there. Here in the economic industrial articles, we already find that Germany is there, Sweden is there, also the UK is there, and especially some more like port cities and so forth. But we don't have many articles yet. It's a kind of early kind of discussion about what could be done with these berries. The situation gets more interesting when we move to the beginning of the 20th century, and here even more we get much more economic industrial articles, so articles that are classified as economic industrial, and we see that let's say the port cities appear in the articles. There's lots of articles that mention, for example, port cities in Germany, same in Sweden. Also, you can look at the Finnish coast. The articles talk about those, so it's about exports from this city to that city. And again, the descriptive, they are very scattered. They are all the time there. So we have news about children getting lost in the woods while berry picking. And the kind of closer look confirms this. So if we just look at the place names that we find, the economic industrial articles, we have countries, we have port cities, we have bigger cities, and in the descriptive articles, we have villages, we have factories, we have smaller places, which are more difficult to identify, but we quite clearly see that there are two types of discourse in the newspapers. Okay, and briefly about this second approach, this is work in progress, something I'm presenting at the Digital Humanities in Nordic and Baltic countries conference, so you can follow the proceedings a bit, something that will be published in the summer or later in the autumn, hopefully there. And here the idea is to use the parliamentary debate datasets published in both countries. So for Sweden, we have the debates for the 19th century, curated in a nice linked open data format from a project called Spheric, and in Finland, also in linked open data, but only from 1907, so from Eduskunta, the unicameral parliament. And here, like mentioned, the analysis that I'm currently doing, it's first working with keywords that I know that appear in the debates, and while reading these debates, again, iteratively adding new keywords that make it easier to actually identify the kind of access rights discourses that I want to find. And then these terms work as seeds for step number 2. So topic modeling, I'm using a bird topic currently. So again, identifying debates about access rights where the word Allemansrätten is actually not mentioned, but when reading and getting more information of the historical debate, we are able to add new keywords to the analysis, and which helps us to identify even more the relevant debates. Okay, but yes, this is a bit repeating the same, so some preliminary results. So really, children, poor of the countryside mentioned. Questions of strangers, I mentioned there, so that was a problem. One of the intense debate was in the 1880s, penal code debate. So there's lots of discussion about strangers coming to the woods. So definitely not any universal principle of access rights, which is of course quite understandable, can be found there. But to conclude, just what I want to share a bit with the group. So more like the kind of empirical results. So the computational tools help to build, perhaps how to put it, a kind of context for reading, context for finding the right debates. So identifying the right debates and building contexts how to read them. So clearly we see that there's a shift towards kind of berries and this, the nature, also the wild nature as a commodity, as a resource. Not only the trees that have been used for centuries in industrial and production, exports, so forth, but also the more wild nature that can be found there. So another important point is this, to remember this algorithmic failure, or thinking when the algorithm fails, when we have problems with our, let's say, computational methods, try to figure out that actually is our for example, method of classification actually helping us to find something new? How are we going to improve our method? And kind of iteratively working back and forth between the data method and the results we are getting. So, and perhaps a bit of interpretation emerging. Instead of talking about the Nordic cultural phenomenon, should we actually be talking more about the kind of economic, rational, industrial visions, expectations behind this, right? So these kind of roots, I think, should be studied much more. So actually, the kind of commercial use of these resources starts making sense when we look at the historical context. That the idea of letting everybody in this context, the poor, the idle, to actually pick these berries for their livelihood was a way to actually extract these resources. So it's a way to create a market, the way to get these berries to the market, to the industries, to the export market. So not so much about thinking so much about more practical considerations of moving and living in the woods, but really thinking in terms of commodities, exporting these commodities and their industrial use in the nation state. All right, I stop there, and I want to thank you, and happy to discuss and answer to your questions or comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matti. This was really fascinating, and I'm sure there's lots of different themes which I'm sure members of our audience will pick up on. Would anyone like to put questions in the chat? You're most welcome to. We also have, I think, the capacity to kind of speak freely as well, if anyone would like to have to kind of present their question themselves. But I see that Zainab, you've already pipped everyone to the post, so I'm going to ask Matti your question first. And so Zainab says, thank you so much for this informative presentation. What properties should a data set have for a digital conceptual history? Assuming we have access to some digital libraries with OCR newspapers or magazines, could we use this as a data set for a digital conceptual history?
Absolutely, a really good question. Absolutely, it's possible to use this for digital conceptual history. So first of all, if we think about the kind of range of digital conceptual history then what one could do with this material is depends on, of course, the team and the technical skills that is currently available. So quite a lot of things we can do just by extracting, well, depending if the concept is quite close to the term, and that's clearly you see that we can work quite a lot with very simple steps like looking at concordances. We can look at collocations and so forth. Just building word windows, looking at where this concept appears. For example, I've done quite a lot, worked in a way that I built word windows around these concepts and then do corpus comparison, try to compare what is the surrounding context that is specific for this this concept. So what are the words that are overrepresented in word windows around this specific concept? So it just mostly comes to the question that how far can you go with your computational analysis? Then we can think about actually doing much more about studying the meaning of the concept, thinking about Cambridge Conceptual Lab and so forth, who have done work closer then to corpus linguistics and so more. But that requires then much more computational skills, of course. What properties should a dataset have? I would divide into kind of metadata that helps us to build subcorpora. So do we need to follow do conceptual history follow the development of let's say conceptual history over time? Of course, that's really relevant. Are we interested in dividing between different newspapers? We might have socialist newspapers, we might have some other newspaper groups and so forth. So I would divide into kind of thinking about the content, what can we do with the content, and then more like a kind of horizontal approach towards the metadata. So what is available beyond that? So year, newspaper, and so forth. So this would be my kind of answer to that. But very good question.
Questions are flowing in. James, I'm going to kick over to you. I think James would like to ask you a question in person.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, hi, sorry, it's slightly easier to say this. So can I just start with a question about Allemansrätten, which is conceptually, as you imagine it, or you think your historical subjects imagine it, is it about the right to use land and resources nearby to where you live or where other people live or where people imagine other people live? Or is it about a kind of a grander concept of sort of moving deep into the hinterland of a country? And my second question kind of depends on your answer to the first in a way, because I'm just curious because I'm curious about that first of all.
Yeah, very good question. So it's mainly about the first one. So I mean, always kind of, it's a bit anachronistic, first of all, try to even find Allemansrätten, because I mean, we can think about today, we don't have any, we think about the context of 19th century, very, let's say, hierarchical societal structures, of course, kind of political rights you have as a landowner and as somebody who doesn't own any land and so forth. So it's very difficult to think about such a universal right to everybody globally that we have today. But you have to start from somewhere. So I would say that still the kind of core of today's Allemansrätten that we would move to the historical context is exactly the your first interpretation. So it's more like being able to access nature in your local environment, pick berries there and so forth. And then to your second question related to that.
Yeah, so my second question then is like, I was interested in your geographical text analysis and the way you sort of presented small villages and towns and small localities. And you used the example of getting lost in the woods quite often, which I really liked. And I was wondering about how does the concept of home fit in here? And is home so connected to this kind of, not literally your house and what you own, but this kind of broader conceptual thing in Nordic culture in this period? Or is it, what I'm trying to get at is that I feel like I come from a culture where home is very much connected to property rights, not to the commons, and we've moved from a kind of sense of home being about the commons to a sense of property rights. And are you still talking about a period here that is about this kind of sense of a kind of home is a sort of a broader conceptual that includes Allemansrätten? Because that kind of changes the way I guess would change the way you might do some of your geographical text analysis.
Very good point. So I think you're completely right there, and I mentioned briefly about this idea of strangers, and that ties exactly to the discussion about home and being close to where you live. And of course, it's quite natural to think, for example, these wild resources of the wild nature. So, for example, if we take wild berries, it's quite a lot in the material that even though that there's no you cannot explicitly say that somebody owns these resources, but if you live close to them, that's something that happens even today. People are annoyed if somebody comes and picks your berries because that's close to your home. And what happens in the context of the 19th century, so the landowners allocate a bit. So okay, these crofters, these people who are renting a piece of my land, they should have those. They should be able to pick those berries, even though there are no regulations. But it's a kind of way of also building the kind of relationship between the landowner and those who are renting the land. So, and the strangers exactly are the difficult group here. Strangers who are not part of this kind of informal relation, even though there's no contract about the berries, but still the kind of the goodwill of the landowner to say that, hey, that area is to you. I've reserved the berries to you. Please go there. So that's clearly visible, rule of home. But I have to. That's a really good concept. I'll need to look more at that, specifically home as a term.
Thank you. It really helps me think about why it's so controversial today, because I guess today is it's a very legalistic framework about what you own and don't own, which maybe doesn't exist quite in the same way.
Absolutely.
In the period. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's really helpful.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is a topic that feels both incredibly contemporary and modern and very timely, but also very timeless at the same time. But Eddie has the question that he's put in the chat. So thank you for a really interesting paper, Matti. I'm wondering how you found dealing with multiple languages through quantitative methods. Did you hit any difficulties or find that software you used dealt better with one language than another? Did things like keenness, which he thinks you mentioned earlier, which I think you did, vary in different languages? Really interesting question. So over to you.
This is a super good question. This is one of the aims actually here is that I'm working with a bilingual data set. The 19th century, both countries, or Finland still used the elite, let's say, or in the parliament, one used still Swedish. So that's actually quite nice that we are able to use same language in both contexts. So here it could be possible to build a kind of Finnish-Swedish main corpus and perhaps do keenness. See the Swedish debates and the Finnish debates as kind of sub-corpora that one could use with keenness analysis. Then coming to the 20th century and working with multiple languages. So one thing we tried with colleague Kimmo Kettunen was to use semantic tags. So the University of Lancaster semantic annotation schema. So that's something that you can use for any language. So if you're interested, we do that in our 2022 paper, so which is published in digital scholarship in the humanities. And there we did keenness based on those. So we first annotated terms with these labels. So for example, you have categories such as money, industry, business, movement, very different categories. And then based on those, we did keenness analysis. This was only for Finnish, and we tested a bit with Swedish, and it seemed that it worked okay. So as long as of course the kind of annotation has been done well, kind of in a comprehensive way for both languages. English is of course, because that has been the basis for the whole project. But then some other languages, you find Finnish, you find Swedish there, I think Italian was there, and many other languages. But keenness, of course, you need to have first some kind of so you have to move first to some level of semantics in some way to actually be able to do keenness analysis. So then another option, something that is work in progress, is to use compare and contrast the languages when doing topic modeling. So would it be possible to identify themes that so topics that are so similar semantically that we would be, for example, able to see that these two topics are so similar in the two languages that we are able to follow them. That would be another strategy, but that's of course ends up into very tricky situations. Again, I mean, coming back to the question of how different the two languages are, how much the MPs talk about different things, how do they use the concept. So we might end up into different problems, but that's something that is possible with larger language models. So using bird topic, for example, for two languages, Finnish and Swedish. So that's something I'm currently working on, and that's something that I see very promising, because we are able to work with the meaning given to the sentences. Bird topic works sentence by sentence, so looking at similarities between sentences. So that should be okay. I had some final point. Then of course moving concepts. That's of course very common in conceptual history, and kind of in this case too, what happens between Sweden, Norway, Finland. Lots of news in English media about this phenomenon. So the concept of Allemansrätten is also moving between the countries. So these moments where actually the concept, the term arrives or appears in some other language. Of course, it's an important moment, an interesting moment of what was translated from language A to language B. And this is something I think should be included always in the analysis when looking at concepts. And for software, I think one should be aiming for, especially for bird models and the large language models, or then, for example, using some kind of semantic annotations. So these have at least worked quite well for me.
And I can see that there's been a very helpful mention of using
excellent
word embeddings that's been put in the chat. So if anyone's curious, I don't see any more questions or hands up. If not, I might just take advantage of the last minute that we have to ask you a question, Matti, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Because you mentioned a couple of times about how the classification wasn't working within the language model, and how actually this misfortune, this algorithmic failure, actually gave rise to an entirely different category and classification that came up. And I was wondering if you could tell us, on the one hand, both why you think that classification kind of failed in terms of in the first instance, but also then how you went about then discovering this new kind of classification and category of this idea of preventing access to kind of private land. Was that by going back to the actual texts themselves and this kind of close reading, traditional analysis, or was it actually through what you were seeing in the data that was coming up? Just some kind of reflection there would be really fascinating.
Yeah. That's a really good question. So the algorithm failed because the training data was not nuanced enough. So I had trained it in a way that I had manually annotated articles, a sample of articles which were economic industrial, and then I put just everything else to the other category. Thought that it would be about this kind of narration and so forth. And then it came out to be that when classifying these and looking at the kind of border cases and going manually through them, where actually we were getting results that were different from my classification, where exactly these articles which were containing, which were also about this prohibitions of accessing the land. So it was then looking at the border cases where the classification was failing. It wasn't the one that we expected, and then reading these more carefully. So of course this was manual work again, and evaluating how well our classifier is working. And this is something that of course you would do in your work, but the mindset is different. Not saying that it was failing, but it was using this failure in improving your approach. This is it, not just improving the method, because that could be another option, saying that okay, we need to add a category and then the method works. But no, we take one more step backward and say that actually there's something interesting happening from a historian's perspective. So why are these? Because this land is now valuable, these resources are valuable, and there are probably some kind of conflicts here. That's why the landowners are publishing these articles. So we are not only improving the method, which would be enough in some case, but actually taking a step backward and hold on. There's now something that we haven't seen before. And that's what I think is the kind of important thing here.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think it's a really salient kind of learning process for so many people in kind of digital history research. I'm afraid, people, we have run out of time, which leaves me all to kind of thank Matti again for this wonderful paper, and for introducing us also so much of this literature. Thank you for providing that slide. That's very helpful for everyone who's interested in following up on this topic further. So kind of round of digital applause or kind of emoji hands from everyone. Final thing to just kind of say for today is that our final seminar will be on the 18th of June, also online via Zoom. You can find the link via the IHR Digital History website page, and that will be with Nick Rybianski from Queen's University Belfast, talking about a completely different period, a completely different part of the world, a completely different project. So we do hope that you can join us, and James has helpfully, of course, put the link in the chat there for anyone who's interested. So thank you again to Matti. Thank you again to everyone for joining from all corners of the world today, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future.
Thank you, and thank you for the great questions and comments. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.